Welcome back to Blooming in Brisbane. Today we're going to chat to Bob the Bee Man in HIGHVALE. So Bob, welcome to Blooming in Brisbane. Tell me about what you do.
I spend virtually all my time with stingless bees. Has been said it's gone way past a hobby, and you've walked around the garden this morning and there's lots and lots of hives and colonies, I prefer to call them, and this is not all. There's some up the road that way and up the road that way. I retrieve them from places where they can't be left, work towards boxing them, or work on developing boxes.
So when did you start working with bees, or when did this passion for bees begin?
Very long time ago. I was 6 when I first saw the bees and I was told what they are. I'd like to think that every 6-year-old in the country was shown what they were. Sadly, that's not the case at the moment. At 10, I got my first colony, and that's the only tree I've ever cut down. And I did cut it down, but 50 odd years ago, kids were different then. Then the situation was different, but no bulldozer was going to get my bees. And that colony stayed in the family home for 25 years before we moved out to Warwick to go farming. I ended up with colonies out there from firewood cutters, so I was doing the rescue thing even then. It was a interesting task. The firewood cutters there came across a different species. They were much quieter than the species here, not so defensive as you found here today. Open a colony here and the bees most definitely express their displeasure at being disturbed. But the colonies out in the west are very placid and easy to get on with. But when I sold the farm and came down here to Sanford, I just made the decision, perhaps as compensation for losing 500 acres and coming down to 1, that I can get back to my bees. Didn't quite realise what that statement would mean, but yes, everything's flowed from that.
How many different beehives do you have here?
I've still got just 2 colonies of apis, the honeybees that everyone regards as honeybees. I call our stingless native bees honeybees as well, just not the honeybee, because our stingless bees do collect honey, but I've got 4 species of stingless native bees here in the various boxes around the yard. It's one species I'd brought down from central Queensland, but the others all occur down here naturally. Always better to keep them in the area that they're adapted. The main species I have is Trigona carbonaria and Trigona Hocking's eye.
So Bob, tell me about the role the bees play in your garden.
Every plant needs some pollinator. Doesn't necessarily have to be a native bee or a stingless bee, because there's actually 2,000 different native bees in Australia. Stingless bees are just 14 of those. And we've got honeybees, but some flies will also pollinate, but most plants need a pollinator. So that's the basic role that they fulfill, is to pollinate that plant so it produces seed. From the bee's point of view, the plant is simply a source of food. It gets nectar, it gets pollen. Nectar is the energy source, pollen is the protein source. So there's a mutual benefit thing going on. It can be quite specific. In Brazil, there are some plants that have a relationship, one bee, one tree. So if that tree goes, so does the bee, vice versa. So, but we don't know of any such relationships here, but then probably no one's looked.
So for the average home gardener that wants to have their own beehive, what would you recommend that they do? How do they start the process?
There are quite a few people now selling stingless beehives. Our procedure has been, we go to a nursery, we look at the racks of plants with that are flowering, and look for those that have got stingless bees on them. The ones that the bees are going to in the nursery are the plants we buy. If walking around our garden, that is largely how the exotic plants here have been chosen. The native plants are ones that we've learnt from experience they've gone to, but we've added extra bits, some we know various birds like and as well, so they're dual benefits. But for stingless bees, there are some extra things that they do need. They need resin as a building material, and there are some specific trees that provide that, some of the pines and cypress, for example, but small gardeners maybe can't provide that. They'll have to hope their neighbours have got one down or out on the street or something.
How do you take care of pests and disease in your garden in terms of chemicals and having bees?
Chemicals, we just don't use. The systemic chemicals especially, we certainly don't use. Once anything that's used and is systemic through the plant will be expressed in the nectar and pollen. That has its effect when the bees collect it, take it back to the hive. It may be very low levels, but the research has shown that levels as low as 2 parts per billion is enough to affect the bees at the biochemical, at the gene level. And I'm not prepared to take that risk, so the groups of chemicals that are used that way are just not on our shopping list at all. We find other ways. There's a range of organic products if you really do get into trouble. If we find there are plants that need to be sprayed, we tend to get rid of the plant and find something that doesn't. A plant that grows well tends not to need spraying. The roses have been an area of contention for quite some time, but we found one variety that grows happily pretty much without anything, and they haven't been sprayed this season, so we'll keep going down that path.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on Blooming in Brisbane. Really appreciate the time you've taken to show us around and to learn a bit more about bees.
You're welcome. Hope you've enjoyed the time in the garden.
Thank you so much for watching Blooming in Brisbane, your local gardening TV show. And next week on Blooming in Brisbane, I visit Murray and find out what aquaponics is, Claire with more wow factor cooking plants, and Noel with hanging baskets, and much more on Blooming in Brisbane.